Guys, we have strayed so far from God. Because riddle me this, how did Jane Austen books go from looking like this to looking like this? In the big old year of 2025, what is going on? Now listen, I am no mathematician. I do words, not numbers, but something isn't adding up. Something is not adding up because what is happening? No, I'm kidding. I'm being facetious, but this week, Penguin Books announced these new editions of Austen's classics, and the internet was outraged. Book Twitter was in uproar. It was the 240 character limit equivalent of riots in the street. It was crazy. Having said that, Book Twitter is always angry about something. Book Twitter's default setting is furious. You say you don't like someone's favorite book, they will send you a death threat. It's the Wild West out there. But with today's video essay, I did want to talk about it. I've been doing lots of research into the cartoonification of books, specifically romance books. And so I'm really going to focus on the romance genre. And these Jane Austen books causing a bit of a stir has reignited this conversation of what does a love story look like? If you have been to any bookstore in the past 5 years, you will have noticed a general shift to illustrated covers. The romance shelf in said bookstore probably looks a little something like this. It's a featureless blob epidemic. Everyone is a featureless blob these days. Romance books now all seem to look like this, but that hasn't always been the case. At one point they looked like this, then they looked like this, and then they looked like this. So today we are going to be deep diving into the history of romance book covers and ultimately the reason for their changing designs. But firstly, a definition. So Pan Macmillan defined a romance novel as one where the love story is the main plot and point of the book. The real conflict and culmination of the story relates to the relationship, and everything else that happens is ultimately serving the central narrative. If the central love story isn't the main thing at stake, then it's not a romance. I guess the point is, many genres will feature love stories in some capacity, but in a romance genre, it is the central dramatic tension of the plot. I also want to say that I'll be drawing a lot of my information in this video from this amazing visual essay from the website Pudding. It was written by Alice Lang and the article is called What Does Happily Ever After Look Like? So I did a lot of supplementary research as well, but this is something that I'll be referring back to a lot of times in this video, so I will leave the link to this article down below. Alice's research documented the way that romance covers have developed and changed over time. So we can see that between 2011 and 2023, romance covers became considerably less raunchy. Around 2011, 30% of romance covers were considered raunchy compared to just 3% in 2023. This correlates with a rise in illustrated covers. In 2011, just 7% of covers were illustrated compared to a whopping 72% by 2023. As illustration rises, raunchiness falls. So in order to see and assess how we got here, I want to rewind all the way back to the beginning of the romance genre and the way it has been both perceived and censored over the years. But before we do that, I wanted to speak a little bit about the language of love, which to me at least is French, and let you know that today's video is very kindly brought to you by Lingoda. Lingoda is a language learning website which I have personally been using for years. They actually do this really cool sprint challenge which encourages you to focus on your language learning every single day. And if you take your classes daily or every second day for 2 months, you get 50% cash back or more free classes, which is such a brilliant incentive to make you actually do it. There's also Lingoda Flex where you can learn at your own pace. On Lingoda, you can learn French, Spanish, German, business English, and Italian. And you can do this through group classes with a native level teacher, but also you can do one-to-one sessions as well. I personally really love the group classes because you have to really pay attention to what everyone is saying, so you get to practice your speaking skills, but also your listening skills as well. And it made me so much more confident with my French. I actually just got back from a trip to Paris, and I'm so grateful that I did this class because I do feel confident when I'm going out to like restaurants or bars, etc., or speaking to people to tell them what I need in that moment. And it feels really nice being able to, go into a supermarket and be able to have an actual conversation with the person who is, helping you with your bags, etc. Also, after your classes, you can look at the class notes and practice in your own time. The class times are super flexible. Honestly, this is the perfect way to learn a new language. So listen, there's no time like the present. Use this as your sign to get started right now. And you can even use my discount code using the code 2025JACK at the link in the description box. You can save 20 euros or the equivalent currency on any language learning course. So why not get started today? Thank you so much to Lingoda for working with me on this video. Now, the origins of the romance novel take us to the late 18th and early 19th century. In 1740, Samuel Richardson released a novel called Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded, in which a young woman tries to resist giving her virginity to a wealthy landowner. It wasn't until a little bit later when women started to write novels for other women, and the romance genre started to be perceived as a feminine urge. And ultimately, the novel as a whole became more associated with women than men. This was especially due to the creation of what was called a circulating library. Circulating libraries basically rented books to people for a fee, kind of like the Blockbuster of bookstores. The result of this, of course, is that books became more accessible to women and the middle class, not just wealthy gentlemen. So there's this cartoon, right? And during my degree, I saw it for the first time and I have never forgotten it. It's like seared onto the inside of my eyelids. And so I went on an absolute witch hunt to try and find it, and I found it. I tracked it down. So this is the cartoon. This is courtesy of the Women's Print History Project, who notes how the illustration plays into stereotypes about female readers and circulating libraries. So you can see that the shelves full of serious books like sermons and histories and voyages and travels are full to the brim, whereas the romance shelves have been completely emptied by female readers. Note the man behind them on the ladder. He is having to go out of his way to access the highbrow literature, whereas the novels are easily accessible. I think this also implies a kind of intellectual snobbery and the kind of mental work that has to go into understanding these books as well as acquiring them. So the fact that these books are higher up on the shelf signifies they are more highbrow. They're harder to access, therefore they are harder to understand. The sermons and the world history, those books are considered to be the male realm, whereas the novels, the romance, and the tales down below are for the women. Notice how the female readers are on the same level as the sleeping dog. I think it implies intellectual laziness, simple-mindedness, the fact that they are closer to an animal, whereas the man is elevated above them. I think the cartoon also suggests abundance and frivolity. You can see how the women have books kind of shoved under their arms. They're carrying a lot of books, whereas the man is going for just one. The women are also all made up, you know, they're dressed nicely. This one cartoon tells us so much about how novels were perceived at the time. The criticisms leveled by the printmakers of the circulating library and Beauty in Search of Knowledge rely on the audience's assumption that women readers didn't have the intellectual fortitude to select virtuous reading materials and might, through their poor choices, fall prey to frivolity or even immorality. The library's role in increasing access to literature for middle-class women raised concerns that this access would corrupt unformed minds with immoral material that women readers weren't educated to recognize and weren't prepared to resist. Intellectual and social elites worried about the degradation of morality, virtue, and taste if the production and consumption of literature got into the wrong hands. And by the wrong hands, they mean women and people who aren't the upper class. And some things just honestly never change. This kind of reminds me of the moralizing of literature on Book Talk and on Book Twitter. I'm sure you've all seen the videos of people talking about how Book Talk is just porn, Book Talk is just smart, Book Talk is disgusting, Book Talk is just a community of porn addicts with a superiority complex. Yes, I am quoting directly. This tendency towards policing what people, especially women, read has never really gone away. Okay, I'm gonna go on a little tangent here, but I remember that there was this one girl on Book Talk, right? She was posting reading updates of her reading experience of the book Six of Crows. And she opens the video by saying that she has been reading the book on her Kindle because the physical formatting of the book was too hard to read. She is referring to the way that the page is laid out, the fact that it has really small margins and that the font size of the text is really, really small.
Can we talk about something real quick though? Can I just talk shit for a second? Why the fuck is this book? First of all, the writing is so tiny. Second of all, why are the pages so filled with so many words? Like, what the fuck? I like pages that aren't filled with this many words. Like, literally every page is like, look at this. Are you fucking kidding me?
Which I think we can all agree would make a book physically harder to read because the formatting is not optimized for a pleasant reading experience. If you're having to squint and it feels like all the words are just like smushed onto the page. Anyway, she says in the video, there were so many words on the page, right? People clowned her for this. People took this one clip of her saying, why are there so many words on the page? Completely out of context. Called her dumb, said there was a rise in anti-intellectualism on the internet, when she was just trying to point out that the font size and the spacing were making the book hard for her to read. Instead, people took her words completely out of context and suggested that she was annoyed that a book had words in it. People called her infuriating, when really she was just critiquing font size, which I think is fair enough. I don't know this girl, but I will ride for her no matter what. If she has 0 fans, I am dead, because I just feel like it was such an injustice. Ultimately, she was a victim of what I have been personally referring to as discourse culture, whereby people have started to engage with the discourse without ever engaging in the original source. And the algorithm does kind of push this because, of course, the discourse encourages, rage bait and loads of engagement, loads of comments of people being like, this is ridiculous. But did any of those people actually go and watch her original video? Because it's very clear that she is not referring to the fact that she's annoyed that the book has words in it. She's annoyed about the font size and the formatting. The reality is that a lot of these commentators are getting a lot of views, getting a lot of followers, and therefore making money by taking other people's words out of context. It's happened to me. It is so annoying that people do this, but they are profiting from rage. This is just one example, but I see it so much, especially on Book Talk and Book Twitter, which is why I bring it up here. Ultimately, my point is that this kind of moral panic about what other people are reading has always seemed to prevail. So going back to the 18th and 19th century now, the moral panic back then was actually very interesting because there seemed to be this crisis about how women were reading and how that was going to corrupt society. But actually, the records show that just as many men as women were reading. As Jan Fergus observes, the popular culture of the time may have identified novels and libraries which sold them as strictly feminine businesses, but the evidence tells another story. In fact, the tastes of male and female readers of all classes were not as different as many scholars have supposed, or as many 18th century moralists alleged. Evidence from borrowing libraries such as Marshall's Library in Bath have actually revealed that male customers like the Prince of Wales and philosophers of the day like Jean-Jacques Rousseau all praised the circulating library as an institution. It was not just women who frequented them and benefited from them. I wonder if it was one of those things where a rise in equality, where women and lower class people could start to access literature, just resulted in paranoia from the previous elites because they felt threatened. I often think of that quote that's like, when you are accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. And I think that's what was happening here. These people were the original gatekeepers of reading. They walked so that Book Talk commentators could run. As time has gone on though, those statistics have changed considerably. So according to the Romance Writers of America who conducted this research, nowadays the number of men reading romance novels has reduced down to just 16%. And I do think that that has been reflected through the ways that romance novels have developed, specifically with their covers. As the romance genre reached more and more women and became a female-dominated space, naturally, publishers feed into this through their marketing, by marketing to women specifically. And this is especially important because the romance genre is responsible for a quarter of the publishing market. The entire ecosystem of the book industry relies on romance novels selling, so they need covers that are going to sell to their target audience. Now let's return to Alice Lang's research. What does happily ever after look like? So at first, romance novel covers centered their female protagonists. Throughout the course of the 20th century, romance novel covers and the stories within reflected women's place in society. In the 50s and 60s, when many more women joined the workforce, corporate romance and doctor-nurse covers were popular. At the same time, with the rise of commercial plane travel, women appeared in scenes abroad, often with highly exoticized supporting characters. Things then started to change around the 1970s and 1980s. As Alice says, this represents an era of more feminist openness in women's sexual desire, challenging Puritan social forces and juxtaposing the two in the social eye. This led to the dawn of what's called the clinch. This gets its name from how a male character would be sort of clinching a woman close to his very ripped body. They are generally scantily clad heterosexual lovers in the immortal embrace as the man protects his damsel in distress. These covers became so homogenous that they even feature often the exact same model, this guy called Fabio. And I am fascinated by him, so allow me to introduce you to Fabio Lanzoni. Fabio Lanzoni graced the covers of around 400 romance novels in his prime. Like Taylor Swift works hard, but Fabio Lanzoni worked harder. He became so synonymous with the genre that he ended up with a cameo in the film Zoolander. He had his own reality show where he tried to find the next romance cover star called Mr. Romance. He had this flowing hair, a chest the size of a small village. In fact, Book Riot did a deep dive into Fabio Lanzoni and found that the circumference of his chest was 48 inches, which is 122 centimeters, which is huge. That is chest for days. For context, the approximate amount of time it takes a white oak tree to grow to a circumference of 48 inches, 122 centimeters, is 76 years. That was the size of Fabio's chest. So now you can see why these female characters are clinging to him for dear life. Apparently, having Fabio on the cover of these books gave them a 50 to 60% rise in popularity. No one man should have all that power. Fabio, I was not aware of your game. This is incredible. He released an album. There was a quarterly fan magazine dedicated to him. He even released his own romance novels, although they were ghost written. But this man had an empire. Joanna Lindsay was the genius behind Fabio's meteoric success. She was the first person to put Fabio on her book covers. And the insane thing is, when she died at the age of 67 and news articles came out, the press and the media didn't focus on Joanna Lindsay. They focused on Fabio's tribute to her. They focused on Fabio rather than the death of the actual author. So anyway, at this time, the romance genre started to face increased criticism. At one point, a British archbishop even claimed that romance novels were directly responsible for an increased divorce rate in the UK. Divorce, babes. Divorce. Scholars condemned romance books for presenting women as passive and weak, to the point that the publisher Harlequin actually started to offer their readers fake book covers to disguise what they were actually reading. So you could put it in this fake book cover and nobody has to know. This reminds me of how earlier on in the century, there was actually a court trial about D.H. Lawrence's book, Lady Chatterley's Lover. This book was set to be banned for containing obscenity. And basically the judge who was in charge of the case, he had to have a copy of this book. So his wife took hold of this copy and read through it. And she circled all of the sexual scenes, all of the obscenity, and she even made him a little bag to put his book in so that no one would know what he was reading. Ultimately, the court case was thrown out and Lady Chatterley's Lover is a book that you can still read to this day. But also, you know, books containing sexual content in France used to be covered with yellow bags, yellow paper, in order to hide their true contents. History repeats itself. This has always been a genre that has been accused of corrupting people. But the sales of romance has never faltered. As technology improved, photographs started to replace these kind of oil paintings of Fabio on the covers. Fabio's day was no more. Fabio, time to retire, my friend. Hopefully we'll see Fabio on like I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, or Dancing with the Stars, or The Traitors or something. I would like to see that. Cover art actually became more explicit and realistic, and lines started to be blurred between romance and erotica. In 2011 and 2012, about a third of the covers still had someone who was at least partially unclothed, almost always a man, alone, or with a clothed lover. In many cases, covers focused on the couple's physical intimacy rather than the nature of the plot. As the decade wore on, people wore more. By 2019, fewer than 10% of covers featured a state of undress. And we still had the clinch to an extent, but people were clothed and clinched rather than nakey. I think this helps to suggest an emotional intimacy as well as a physical one. But nowadays, we're down to less than 3%. And actually, most covers these days have the characters kind of at different parts of the cover actually not touching. So, what replaced the raunchiness? Well, we're back to illustrations. But instead of kind of detailed oil paintings of ripped men, aka Fabio, now illustrated covers tend to be a little bit more ambiguous. My theory is so that you can kind of insert yourself or people that you know and maybe fantasize about a little bit into the romance books. Since these blobs don't really look like anyone distinctive, you can use your imagination to fill in the gaps and sort of in that way partly design your own story in your imagination. Instead of their physical attributes or attributes, people on romance book covers now are defined more by their hobbies and their jobs and their lifestyle. So if you think of the cover of Book Lovers, for example, you can see that these two people are both engaged with literature. In Check and Mate, you can see that these two people are interested in chess, so on and so forth. And honestly, in a world where many women are sexualized in most art forms, this does actually feel like a way of reclaiming their identities in a totally non-objectified way. So in 2011 and 2012, there were just 7 illustrated covers of the 169 that made Publishers Weekly's lists. In these years, and through to 2017, most covers remained photorealistic. The few that did use illustrations typically focused on an artifact of the plot or an abstract graphic to highlight the title instead. Whereas now, they are pretty much ubiquitous. So what changed between 2017 and 2025, where we've seen the proliferation of illustrated book covers, like totally illustrated book covers? Well, Helen Huang released a book called The Kiss Quotient. She released it in 2018, and I'd actually really recommend this book. It's about a neurodivergent character who wants to have sexual experiences, and so she hires a male escort. And of course, they end up falling in love. She asked her publisher for a fun illustrated cover to help slip past unconscious bias related to the race of her lead character, who is Asian. As in the 20th century, plot context regained its position on the cover. We start to get an insight of what the book is actually about, what these characters do. The illustrated style took over across bookshelves from 18% of covers featuring that style in 2018 to 61% by 2022. Now, when you go into your local bookshop, you'll probably notice that pretty much every romance book looks like The Kiss Quotient. By 2023, 72% of titles were illustrated, and the colors teal, yellow, pink, and purple made up the primary shades of romance. Now, listen, everyone has opinions on design choices, and whether you appreciate this aesthetically is down to personal taste, personal preference, which everyone is entitled to. Okay, that's one thing. But I wanted to point out the moral issue of this kind of homogeneous book cover design, because many of these books do contain highly erotic content, but from their covers, for example, It Happened One Summer, you would never know how filthy this book is, just by looking at it. I think this harks back to that tradition of covering books, of being kind of embarrassed by the sexual content of books. But what happens when this falls into the hands of people who were not expecting highly erotic content because the cover didn't give them any indication that this would include that? The reality is that it's now impossible to distinguish between young adult fiction and highly erotic adult fiction, which is not meant for children, because it ultimately just kind of all looks a bit the same. For instance, these books all look identical. We have Icebreaker, we have Desire or Defense, we have My Phony Valentine, Rival Darling, and Pucking Wild. Desire or Defense, Rival Darling, and My Phony Valentine are not smutty at all, whereas Icebreaker and Pucking Wild are dirty. Like crazy. There are teachers who have shared on TikTok that 10-year-olds were coming into school carrying a copy of Icebreaker, and ostensibly, from the outside looking in, it looks like a book written for teenagers, for young people. But actually, it isn't appropriate for a 10-year-old to read at all. I guess you could easily make the argument here that parents should be keeping an eye on what their children are reading, but ultimately, this does look like it is written for them. And I feel like very busy parents do not have the time to be reading every single page of a book to make sure it's appropriate for their child to read. We have to think realistically here about what is actually possible. So the Washington College Review actually conducted some research around this. According to Dmitry Kirkik, the romance genre has always been popular, but thanks to social media, it is becoming more popular with younger readers. He writes, romance readers are getting younger. 10 years ago, the main romance reading group was women aged 35 to 54. Today, the main romance reading group is women aged 18 to 54. Kirkik also states that romance sales grew by 52% from 2021 to 2022, showing social media's influence on the genre. But also, when you increase your target demographic to people much, much younger, naturally you increase your potential market size. So publishers do profit from doing this, and I think that's why it kind of becomes a little bit dicey, because cynically, doesn't that kind of incentivize publishers to hide the sexually explicit content of their books, because it means that young people are more likely to buy them or not be stopped from buying them. The issue is what happens when books are pushed towards young readers that aren't appropriate for young readers. There's a great article by Paste magazine about exactly this. The lines between YA and adult fiction have often been vaguer than expected. We had to create the entire new adult category to explore that liminal space between them, and the audience crossover is big. Cartoon covers often feel like a way to take advantage of that, although the amorphous nature of this trend seems doomed to lead to multiple instances of reader miscommunication. And it's tough, because would an explicit logo, like on album covers, prevent this? Or would that deter anyone from reading them? Is it kind of like, you know, when you have to go and buy toilet paper from the supermarket and then you have to walk home with like big stacks of toilet paper under your arm? I don't know why it feels so embarrassing. It's like, ew, that guy shits. That guy poos. I don't know. I feel like if the romance book I was reading had a little explicit sign on the corner, it'd be like, ew, it's the sex guy with his sex book. Like, why would I feel so embarrassed by that? Or perhaps there should be a spicy ranking on the back of a book, but then would novels start to look like Nando's menus? There was actually one author who color-coded her books based on the spicy rating. So the covers were different colors based on how intense and erotic they were as you go through the shades, the 50 shades, if you will. But also, at the end of the day, does this kind of distill books down to just how smutty they are? This kind of reminds me of that tweet or comment or something when White Nights by Dostoevsky started to go viral. This really intense book about yearning and unrequited love from 1848, and the top comment was like, how much smut does this contain? What's the spice level of Dostoevsky? Like, as I said, we have strayed so far from God. It's funny actually mentioning 50 Shades of Grey, because I wonder what 50 Shades would look like if it was published in 2025. Would it look something like this? One of my favorite YouTubers, itsdivyag, makes incredible videos reimagining book covers, and she created this design for Romeo and Juliet in a kind of illustrated book cover design, as well as this edition of Mice and Men. Not the TikTokification of George and Lenny. I'll link her videos down below, along with all of my other sources that I used to research for this video. I know it sounds like I'm joking here, and this does really feel like a bit of a non-issue to get riled up over, but it's actually a very interesting moral dilemma, I think. And the more I researched it, the more fascinating I found it. So to give you an example, there's a book called The Perfect Play, which changed its book cover from this to this based on the new trend in illustrated covers. It looks like a completely different book. It looks like it's aimed at a completely different market and audience, but the text is the same. Obviously, I have to add here a caveat that this isn't a new phenomenon in marketing. You know, take Twilight. When there was the huge sensation around Twilight, classic books changed their covers to try to appeal to the huge Twilight audience. Books like The Scarlet Letter and Wuthering Heights changed their covers to be Twilightified, if you will. And now these editions look like they were written by Stephanie Meyer. It's actually so interesting. And so this brings us to the Jane Austen of it all. You know what's crazy is that now, because Jane Austen is on the £10 note, you can buy a Jane Austen with a Jane Austen. That messes with my mind. Jane Austen was one of the first really successful female writers, and her works have really stood the test of time. You know, the humor, the narratives, they speak to a kind of eternal, universal truth, and modern audiences have continued to enjoy their work. Even a few years ago, I hosted a TikTok book club, and one of our picks was Persuasion by Jane Austen, and we were reading that alongside contemporary romances like Honey and Spice, because it is just as relevant today as it was when Jane Austen first wrote it. And an important piece of context here is that Jane Austen's works are now in the public domain. So let me briefly explain how that works. So a book enters the public domain, meaning it is no longer copyrighted, after either 95 years of publication or 70 years after the author has died. So the copyright for Jane Austen has expired. A recent example of copyright expiring is George Orwell. So you may have seen that a lot of different publishers are reissuing George Orwell's books with new cover designs. That is because those books are now in the public domain. So because Jane Austen's books are in the public domain, any publishers can reissue copies of these books. And that is what Puffin did. So Puffin is the children's imprint of Penguin Random House. And listen, they had a Canva subscription and a dream. And this is what they came up with. And like I said at the beginning of the video, there was a little bit of backlash. Penguin Books slammed for TikTokifying Jane Austen with patronizing new covers as people moan that all books look the same now. I will say I think that this became sensationalized because of the new introductions that are included in these books. So basically, Puffin asked YA authors to write introductions to each of Jane Austen's books, and they sound a little something like this. So this is the foreword to Persuasion by Alexis Hall, who wrote Boyfriend Material and A Lady for the Duke. Anne and Wentworth are legit freaking soulmates. Also, I can't even say it seriously, I'm sorry. Anne and Wentworth are... Sorry. Anne and Wentworth are legit freaking soulmates. Also, independently of that, Wentworth is great. Then we have Hannah Grace introducing Sense and Sensibility. She is the author of Icebreaker, as we've been speaking about, and Wildfire. She says, if Eleanor were real, I'd bet that her favorite Taylor Swift song would be This Is Me Trying. Like... I mean, they kind of made a rod for their own backs here, right? The chokehold that Taylor Swift lyrics and songs have over YA authors should be studied by science, because you could have like a bingo sheet and you will tick off Taylor Swift reference in a YA novel every single time. Tessa Bailey, who wrote It Happened One Summer and The Au Pair Affair, she introduces the novel Emma by saying, perhaps Emma Woodhouse didn't know who she would end up with, but all the romance authors in the house definitely did. So... on one hand, as someone who has studied these books at university, something inside me cringes a little bit. Yes, that is true. But two things can be true at the same time. On the other hand, I also do think that this is very great for access to these books. And it can really help people with making these books more approachable by explaining them in their terms, in their vocabulary, in the lexicon that they are acquainted with. It can make these books feel less intimidating. It can kind of act as a map for what to look out for. You know, how to contextualize these characters in the way that you understand. And the reality is that a lot of young people fall out of love with classics and with reading because they are put into an academic setting where they're told, you have to write an essay about this, which you will be graded on in a way that they may never have experienced with, you know, chart music or popular films and TV. So as a result, books kind of get turned into this purely academic thing that a lot of people run away from, and they stop identifying themselves as readers. So if we can do anything to combat that, then we should. I started making booktube content because I wanted to talk about books in pop culture so that people who didn't consider themselves readers would be able to reacquaint themselves with the passion of reading and the literary world. So if these editions of Austen's work do that for people, then ultimately I suppose that's a net positive thing. And the reason I say this specifically is because there are other editions of Jane Austen's books that you can buy. Like, if you don't want to read those editions, if you don't want to have the kind of cartoon covers, or you don't want those forewords in your edition, you don't have to buy them. You know, I recently bought the Penguin cloth-bound classic editions of Jane Austen's works because those spoke more to me. So because these books are in the public domain, it means that there are many different editions of these books that you can collect that fit your personal taste if you want to. Different covers can be made to appeal to different readers. There is no one cover of this book that is meant to appeal to everyone like a brand new book would have. So I suppose the outrage around this kind of does reek of intellectual snobbery in a way. It's a way of gatekeeping, again, that a classic book must be cloth bound or feature an old oil painting on the cover, you know. They don't. They can look any way you want them to look. So ultimately, are these new covers really that harmful, or are they just increasing the appeal of a much loved and celebrated author who we could all learn something from? Well, the other side of the coin, I think, is that I worry that this YA style sets the books up for failure because they are not YA books. You're not going to see the words freaking legit in Jane Austen. You're not going to see her referring to the characters as Taylor Swift songs. If you go in expecting it to read like an Ali Hazelwood book, you kind of are being set up for disappointment, unfortunately. So in that sense, is it kind of false marketing that the exterior from the outside, it looks like a young adult book, but actually when you open it up, that wasn't Jane Austen's intention? I don't know. I don't think there's a straightforward answer, but I do think it's interesting to think about and discuss. Hence why I ended up making this whole diatribe rant video research about it. And I will say, this is not Penguin's first offense. They have done this once before as well. I do think that these covers got away with it a little bit more because they're more abstract, but they also cartoonified Shakespeare. They also re-released Shakespeare's work with a young adult audience in mind, with the hope of increasing his appeal once again. These ones, though, were met with a much warmer reception. At the end of the day, I do think that the point of these covers is to expand the reach of the audience of these books, of these classics, and kind of breathe new life into them based on the current marketing trends. But I do think that publishers have a responsibility not to missell or misrepresent their product. Like, you don't want to manipulate people into reading something that ultimately they won't like. Especially because the romance genre, more than any other genre, really suffers from this. You know, Nancy Pearl, who is one of America's well-known librarians, she talks about the romance genre, and I'll never forget this quote. She said, "Literary fiction is always judged by the best examples of it, and romance is always judged by the worst." I think that's really true. So could this effort to flatten the romance genre into something so distinctive and easily noticeable and homogenous, where every book has exactly the same kind of cover design, could that ultimately harm the genre? I do also want to take a moment to point out that this is not the only genre that this style of marketing happens in. You know, if you look at fantasy books, they are often quite easily identifiable by the ways that their covers are designed, or even the titles. You know, it's like The Castle of Sorrow and Stone, The Court of Timber and Tyrants, The Road of Yellow and Brick. Like, it's always the something of something and something. And literary fiction too, for a while, was kind of these abstract blobs and face silhouettes. You know, this happens across every genre. It's not just a romance genre specific thing, but I did think that romance was especially interesting to analyze and talk about in this way, especially because the moral dilemmas of this genre around sexually explicit content bring up some fascinating debates. So, what do you think? I hope that this video gave you some kind of food for thought and an overview of the industry, the history of the romance genre. And thank you very, very much for watching. You can follow me over on Instagram, on TikTok, on my second channel, on Goodreads, Letterboxd if you want. You know, I will be anywhere with an internet connection. You can, of course, subscribe to this channel if you're new. Give this video a like if you liked it. If you like, you know, no one's forcing you. I'm not holding you at gunpoint. If you want to, now would be a good time. Leave me a comment letting me know what you thought. And until next time, all the best. Stay in touch. Have the most wonderful day. I love you to the moon and back. And I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.